All right, it is past 7:07, so we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, well, welcome Eric Hernandez to Rochester Christie UNT.
Thank you.
Thank you for helping us build our chapter here. We'll get started, and we're really excited about learning about the soul. So I want to introduce Eric to you all so you know a little bit more about him. I told you he is the Texas Baptist. He's the lead apologist at Texas Baptist. He has a real heart, for proclaiming the gospel. He's got a theology degree, but he also has an apologetics degree, so a good combination of both. He is a licensed minister, certified information therapist, certified formation therapist, and he's on the Denison Forum Advisory Board and apologetics through the millennial spectrum. Well, like me, he has a certificate of apologetics from Biola University, because Biola Bible Institute at Yale University. And he is spoken and debated some of his debates on Hebrew and welcome. And he's really good rhetorically, I found. And so we may convince him to come back and see a debate or some rhetoric sometime on a certain issue. Yeah. Holds an associate degree in social science, a bachelor's degree in theology, and as I mentioned, a certificate from Biola University. So we're going to learn about evidence for the soul tonight. He's so into it, as I mentioned to you. He resides to see a soul. He knows a lot about that soul. And at the end, I'm going to give you all some announcements about what's coming up next week and how we can promote that as well. So let's hold on that and focus on the soul right now. So Eric Hernandez, let's do it. Eric, welcome.
How long do you usually go for the presentation?
45 minutes.
Perfect.
An hour.
Okay, perfect. Would y'all prefer I stand here, go over there? I don't.
And Eric, can you open prayer?
Please, yes.
Yeah.
I always need that.
Heavenly Father, you're so good to us to bring us together tonight, all inquiring minds, Lord, about you and your goodness, and the mysteries, Lord, some of which we'll never discover, but some that you've made us able to discover, Lord. One of those is the soul. We know that you're going to be with us tonight, you're going to guide us, teaching to us, guide our questions, help us to be wise. Yes, all of this, Jesus,
Amen. Yeah. So, like you mentioned, you can find my name, Eric Hernandez, on YouTube. Would really appreciate a subscribe. Smash that like button. Twitter, stuff like that. Eric Hernandez Ministries, all that jazz. If you want to know more about me, you can. Some of my stories on YouTube, some of my debates on YouTube. Just don't read the comment section because, as everyone knows, it's not the most reliable place. So let's jump in. Jump in if this will. I don't think it's working. Well, talk awkwardly amongst yourselves. Okay. So, freshman year of college, I took my first philosophy class. I really enjoyed it. In fact, the reason I took it, to be honest with you, was because I wanted to take an elective that looked easy, that I could skip, and philosophy seemed like the perfect thing to do. In fact, I thought philosophy was just making stuff up, and I was good at that. So I figured, yeah, I could take this class and skip whenever I wanted because it's pretty easy. But lo and behold, I found out pretty quickly that my professor was an atheist. Now, I learned a lot in his class and actually really enjoyed it, and that motivated me to take another class in philosophy. So I decided to look at my next semester in taking another philosophy class, but all of my peers warned me, if you're going to take another class in philosophy, whatever you do, don't take Professor Pena's class because he's an atheist, he's antagonistic, he's condescending towards Christianity, and if you take his class, you might lose your faith. And my response was, where can I sign up? Because at the time, I had questions, and I want to get into the whole backstory, but suffice it to say that in church, questions weren't encouraged. They were sometimes discouraged, and I've gotten in trouble on a few occasions, but in philosophy class, questions were encouraged. And call me crazy, but I've always known that if God exists and Christianity is true, then I should know why that's the case. But I also knew that if Christianity was false, I'd still like to know why, and perhaps this professor was the man for the job. So one pivotal day in class that really shifted everything and quite frankly set me on the path to get to where I am now was the following. He walks in the class one day, and he pretends like he's holding up his antidepressant drug. And he says, now, religion wants us to believe in a soul. And because of this, we can have a hope in an afterlife and seeing our family and friends who have passed away before us. But according to Christianity in particular, your emotions, your moods, your thoughts, your feelings all reside within your soul, and all of these things are supposed to be immaterial. But here's the problem. If I were to take this antidepressant pill, how is it that something tiny and physical, how can this have the power to change and affect the alleged immaterial states of my soul? Because every time you look at neurons and we look at brain scans, all we see are these neurons firing. And every time we look at the body under a microscope, all we find are the base elements of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and so forth. But you never find anything like a soul. Why is that? And he said, well, the answer is simple. I'll tell you why. The answer is because there is no soul, there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no God, there is no afterlife. We're just a physical brain and body. And we need to learn to live with this fact and get on with our lives and stop believing in these foolish fairy tales. So much time later, class was dismissed. Well, that troubled me for many reasons. First, while I had heard many complaints given against Christianity, here was for the first time in my life, I heard an argument that if true would actually mean Christianity is false. Here's why. When you look at 1 Corinthians and you look at what Paul is saying, he basically says that if Christ hasn't been raised from the dead, then essentially Christianity is false. Our faith's in vain, our faith is powerless, it's useless, and people should actually feel sorry for us. But point in case, if there is no resurrection, then Christianity can't be true. So, no resurrection equals Christianity is false. But I also knew that by the same token, if there's no soul, then there can be no resurrection, and thus, by the same line of logic, Christianity would be false. So, how would we respond to something like this? Let's unpack first. What is a soul? I'm going to go through a lot of definitions and a lot of stuff. Now, you can see some of this stuff on my YouTube channel. I'll give you the link at the end, but we're going to go through a lot of definitions. I'm going to be kind of quick because there's a lot to go over, but we'll take some questions at the end. So, a definition for the soul. The soul is an immaterial substance that possesses consciousness and animates the body. And for our purposes here, we're going to focus on these two aspects. So there are two basic points when given a case for the soul, or rather the case that I give for the soul. The first is that consciousness is not physical. And the second is that I am more than a brain and body. And based on this, it would follow that therefore I am a soul. Now, first thing, what does science have to say about this? Because usually, especially in debates, if you've seen some of the debates I do on the soul, I get this so much that in the opening part of my debates, when I debate the soul is, first of all, science has virtually nothing to say about the topic. Let me explain why. Suppose your neighbor calls you and he says, so you're not going to believe this, but there's an invisible man living in my house. And being the skeptical person that you are, you say, okay, let me go investigate this claim for myself. So you go to his house and you start searching. You look everywhere. You look in the attic, the closet, the bathroom, you look under the bed, you look every possible place you can, and not once do you see this invisible man. So being upset with your neighbor, you come up to him and you say, excuse me, you told me that there's an invisible man in your house, but after looking everywhere, I didn't see him. And of course, he'd look at you kind of funny and say, well, of course you didn't see him. He's what? Invisible. Now, the problem is similar when you look at an alleged question or objection asking what science or neuroscience has to say about the soul. Here's why. While science is a wonderful tool for studying the physical world. The soul, if it exists, would be a non-physical immaterial entity. And thus, to use science to try and investigate something that is non-physical, when it itself is something restricted to the physical, would be like trying to use a ruler to measure your weight. As atheist philosopher of science Michael Roos says, science does not ask certain questions, so it is to no surprise it does not give certain answers. So, as I just mentioned, trying to use science to investigate the soul would be like using a ruler to measure your weight. It is simply the wrong tool for the assessment. Now, the right tool would be areas of metaphysics and philosophy. And without going too deep, this is the foundation for arguments for the soul. It's the longer phrase is Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals. That's the $5 word. We'll save money and just call it the law of identity. Now, to understand the law of identity, it's basically this. When you take two things that are in question, some A, according to Leibniz's law, if A is the same thing as B, then whatever is true of one is going to be true of the other. But, as I just spoiled, if there's something true of one that is not true of the other, or vice versa, then it follows it cannot be the same thing. Here's an illustration. Suppose you walk into a lab and you see two bottles of clear fluid, and you want to know, are they the same substance? So one label says water, but the other one is chemical X. But let's suppose that this label was ripped off and you can't read it. So you want to use Leibniz's law of identity and see, are they the same substance? Because if they are, then they're going to share the same properties. Well, you look and see they're both clear and they're both fluids. And thus far you think, well, then they must be the same substance. But then suppose you turn over the bottle that says chemical X and on the back it says caution flammable. And you think, well, I know water's not flammable, which means even if I don't know what chemical X is, at the very least, I know that they cannot be the same thing. Does that make sense? Okay. With this in mind, let's look at the first point, that consciousness is not physical. Now, what is consciousness? Consciousness is something that you would define ostensibly, which means it's a definition that you point to, not necessarily articulate. If you were to ask me to define the color purple, I could not give you a definition of it. Instead, I would have to point to something that is a color purple or green. In the same way, consciousness is defined ostensibly, and there are 5 states of consciousness. And they are thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will, or we can say volition. So think of it this way. Water is a substance that can come in 3 different states, solid, liquid, and a gas, and each state has different properties. In the same way, consciousness is something that exists that also comes in 5 different states. So any state of consciousness you can think of is going to fall under one of these 5 states. Now, with this in mind, if what my professor was saying is true, his argument is essentially that the mind and brain are the same thing. If there is no soul, then something called physicalism would be true. And that is essentially the idea that human beings, as my professor was trying to argue for, are nothing more than purely physical objects composed of purely physical properties and parts. Now, if that's the case, again, then the mind would have to be either identical or reducible to something physical like the brain. Given Leibniz's law of identity, this would mean that whatever is true of the mind must be true of the brain and vice versa. But again, if we can find something true of the brain that's not true of the mind and vice versa, then it would follow they cannot be the same thing. So here's a question. Is consciousness physical? Well, no, it's not. And it's easy to show, and again, using Leibniz's law of identity, there are dozens of examples I can give, and I could spend the entire hour just talking about consciousness, but let's go over 3. My mind, take a state of my mind, something like a thought or belief. My thoughts or beliefs can be true or false, but note that no region in my brain is true or false. In other words, it makes sense to say that this belief I hold to is true, but it doesn't make sense to say that these correlating group of neurons firings are false. It wouldn't even make sense to conceive of that idea. My brain can be in a state that weighs 3 pounds, but the thought that I'm talking to you right now doesn't weigh 3 pounds. While we may be having heavy thoughts, by the end of the night, you're not going to go buy a neck brace because, it's too much to bear. My brain can be in a state that is 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana, which is in my mind, is not 7 inches long. And again, I can go through many, many more examples, but the point is clear. If all the properties of the mind are non-physical, and if all the properties of the brain are physical, then it follows that if consciousness exists, it it can't be something physical. Hence, if questions exist, it wouldn't be physical. Now, what about though what my professor said, right? He said, but hold on, there's this relationship that when I do something physical that affects my physical brain, something happens to the states of my mind. In fact, we can push the point further and say, even in cases of brain damage like Alzheimer's, if there is certain deterioration or damage to certain parts of the brain, it would affect certain states of my mind, like my memory. Would this prove that consciousness is nothing more than the brain? Well, no, and here's why. Simply put, because cause or dependence is not the same thing as identity. Let me explain what I mean. Suppose I were the world's greatest guitar player, which I'm not. If anything, I used to play drums. But suppose I had a guitar. And when I was playing, one of the guitar strings popped. Now note, there is going to be a cause and effect or dependent relationship between my ability to play the music and a properly functioning, properly tuned guitar. If my guitar string popped, I would no longer be able to play, say, the note C. But would it follow from this that therefore I am a guitar? No, because although there's a cause and effect relationship, it doesn't follow that they're the same thing. Or going back to the example of the note C, suppose enough strings popped where I could no longer play the note C. Would it follow that therefore the note C was located somewhere inside the guitar, or maybe on one of the strings of the guitar? No. In other words, it's not as if I were to break the guitar open, the note C would fall out of it, right? Why? Because the note C is not something physical, and though there's a cause and effect dependent relationship between the notes and the guitar and the strings, it doesn't follow the same thing. So basically, again, although there is this dependent or causal relationship between a guitarist and a guitar, it doesn't follow the same thing any more than affecting the physical states of my brain can have effects on my mind. Once again, doesn't follow the same thing, because as I stated earlier, the mind and brain are not the same thing, and cause or dependence is not the same thing as identity. So I want to make this point clear because this always comes up in any discussion I have with non-believers or people who don't believe in the soul. They say, yeah, but if this happens to your brain, it affects your mind. Right, but that's not like it's something that we recently discovered because of neuroscience. Even cavemen would have known that if you hit me over the head really hard with a club, I'm going to get dizzy. So obviously, there's always been this understanding that there's a cause and effect relationship. So it's no new epiphany of something of that sort. We can touch more on that if you'd like when we go over questions. So consciousness is not physical. What about the second point? Now, remember my definition. What is a soul? It's an immaterial substance that possesses consciousness. Here's what I mean by that. If consciousness exists, and we've already established it's not physical, then the next question to ask is, well, what is it that possesses consciousness? And I have no doubt at all that, well, I possess consciousness. Now, note the word I is what's called an indexical word, which means it is something that refers to a thing. So when I say the word here or there, it's an indexical word that is referencing something. When you use the word I, what are you referencing? If you say the body, well, then we'll see how that kind of gets into some problems. But suffice it to say, for now, we can say that I am consciousness. But of course, like I said, what is the I? What is the self? Well, this goes a little bit deeper into what's known as substance dualism, which is a position I'll be defending. What is substance dualism? It is a view, a very, for the sake of purpose, a very abbreviated definition would be that I am a soul that has a brain and body. So to make this clear, I am a soul. I have a body, but I don't have a soul. Rather, I am a soul, and a body without a soul would be nothing more than a corpse. Does that make sense? Now, to be honest, I actually did recently change my views on this because I actually do believe I have a soul, and it's parked in the garage, and it's a Kia Soul, and it's orange. Thank you for those 2 laughs. Yeah, but that was, you guys knew that earlier. And I really did buy that car just so I can make that joke, and it's worth every penny. It's a rich joke, if you will, the rich punchline. So if I am a soul and a soul is a material, then it follows that I am a material. And if the brain and body are physical, then it follows that I am not identical or reducible to a brain and body. Hence, our second point, I am more than a brain and body, I am a soul. Now, again, I could spend a whole other hour talking about this, but let's go through 3 arguments for this second point. Again, using the law of identity, we're going to basically say that if I have some certain properties that are not shared with my brain and body and vice versa, then it follows I'm not the same thing as a brain and body. I must be something more, namely the soul. Now, if I were identical to my brain and body, let's look at it this way, then I would be what we call in philosophy a mereological aggregate. So for short, we'll just say an aggregate, and an aggregate is a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. For example, things like watches, cars, and Lego bricks are what we would call aggregates. They are not true wholes in and of themselves, but rather are a collection of several parts, right? This whether it's a car or maybe an example of here, there are several parts that are just arranged in a certain structure. Now, here's the thing about aggregates. Take a tricycle, for example. If I were to remove one of the wheels of a tricycle, then notice that metaphysically speaking, a tricycle has ceased to exist and a bicycle has come into existence, which means that when it comes to purely physical objects, they are not going to retain identity through change. So here's the example. If anybody's seen WandaVision? Yes, very good. We have some good Christians in the house. During one of the episodes, the two visions talk to each other. Spoiler alert, sorry. And they talk about what? What philosophical concept? Do you remember? Ship of Theseus, very good. So here's a more modern example of the ship of Theseus. Take this car. Suppose that I were to change the tires of this car. Here's my question. Is it the same car? Before you answer that, let's suppose we were to, over time, replace virtually every single part of the car, every nut and bolt, every windshield, everything on it, give it a brand new shine, and now we can ask, is it the same car? Before you answer that question, suppose we were to take the replaced parts and put those back together, and now you have two distinct cars. Now the question is, which one is the original? Whatever your answer is, one thing is clear, they both cannot be the original. So from this, we can conclude that therefore, aggregates do not maintain identity through change or part replacement. We good so far? One person, very nice. So here's the argument. The argument from identity through change. I am either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or an immaterial soul. If I am a purely physical object, then I do not retain identity through change. So, two options. I'm either an aggregate or a soul. Well, the question becomes this. Do I retain identity through change and part replacement? Consider this. Suppose I committed a crime 10 years ago. Based on what we know from biology and science, we know that every 7 to 10 years, you replace virtually every cell in your body. So here's a question. If I committed a crime 7 to 10 years ago, and suppose a detective comes to my house and knocks on my door. Some of you may know who this is. And he comes and says, Eric, we just found the evidence to convict you. And I'm sorry, but I got to put the cuffs on. And I say, Jay, look, you and I both know that we replace virtually every cell in our body every 7 to 10 years, which means that crime that was committed 7 to 10 years ago wasn't me, it was another guy. Go find him, but good luck, he doesn't exist. Of course, he's going to smile and say, no, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to take you in. Which means, quite frankly, I do maintain identity change. In fact, an interesting argument was given or proposed by Jaegwon Kim, who's an atheist philosopher of mind. And in his book, Philosophy of Mind, he presents the argument as follows. He says, in 2011, this brain and body did not exist. But I did exist in 2011, therefore I'm not a brain and body. Again, identity change. So if I do maintain identity through change, then it follows that I'm not a purely physical object, therefore I am a soul. Second argument, the indivisibility of personhood. Again, I am either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. Premise 2, well, purely physical object can be divided and come in percentages or degrees. Now, to understand this point, we need to look at what are degree properties. In philosophy, a degree property is a thing that can be divided. It's a property that can exist in various percentages or degrees. So for example, something can be softer or harder or louder or quieter. So when it comes to a degree property, it's a property that can fluctuate or change. Now contrast that with a non-degree property. This is something that is the opposite. It cannot be divided and it cannot exist in percentages or degrees. We can say it is an all or nothing kind of thing. To illustrate, take the property of being even. The number 2 and the number 6 are both even numbers, but it would make no sense to say that the number 6 is, quote, more even than number 2. Why? Because evenness is an all or nothing kind of property. There's no in between. It either is or it isn't. So with this in mind, consider the following. Take a table, which would be an aggregate. It would make sense to say that if I broke a table in half and burned the one half, it makes sense to say that I have 50% of a table. But if you were to chop off my arms and legs or cut me in half, it wouldn't make sense to say that I am now 50% of a person, right? Because even paraplegics or people who have had their limbs amputated are not half persons, they're still full persons, just with some missing body parts. But suppose someone may say, well, hold on, it's not about the body, it's about the brain. But still, the same thing would apply. If you take something like Dandy-Walker syndrome or anencephalic disease, it is a condition where sometimes children are born with only 30% of a brain, 10% of a brain. There's been operations where doctors have had to actually remove parts of people's brain. But if you were to remove 30% of my brain, am I now 70% of a person? Or am I still a 100% person that's missing 30% of his brain? Obviously the latter. So point is, I cannot be divided for common percentages or degrees. Why? Because I am an all or nothing kind of thing. I am being a person, it is a non-degree property. Well, then therefore it follows that I am not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul. Free will. First of all, again, definitions. What is free will? We'll define it this way. Again, lots we can go into, but it's basically being the original source or first cause of your will or action. Here's an example. That is to say, you are not caused to act by something prior or external to yourself. If I were to raise my hand, if I made that action occur and I was the source of that movement, then you could say I had free will because I was the first mover in this chain of events. But if you were to say tase me with some electric shock and it caused my arm to go up, then that action wasn't caused by me as a first mover. Instead, the taser was what caused my hand to go up. So in that instance, I wouldn't have had free will. Here's an example. Suppose someone's murdered with a gun. Although it was the bullet that penetrated the heart, note that we don't blame the bullet for the murder. Why? Because we assume that the bullet was not the cause of its own actions. So let's take a step back and look at the gun. The gun was fired by the bullet which penetrated the heart, but still we don't blame the gun. Why? Because again, not the cause in this chain of events. We look at the person and we say that these two things are secondary causes, and we rightly assume that the person was the first cause of the chain of events that caused the gun to fire, that caused the bullet to shoot, and that penetrated the heart and killed the person, and thus this person, the first cause, is the one responsible, morally responsible for the event. Does that make sense? Okay, now here's the argument. I am either a purely physical object, again, a physical aggregate, or an immaterial soul. However, if I am a purely physical object, then I do not possess free will. In other words, I would just be the gun and the bullet, because see, if we're not going to blame the gun and bullet for the murder, then if I don't have free will, we shouldn't blame the person either. Think of it this way. Aristotle said, if I move a rock with the staff, then I can say that the staff moved the rock, my hand moved the staff, but then he asked the question, but what moved me? So if there's no soul and there's no God, suffice to say that if atheism is true, the law of what's known as causal closure would be true. What does that mean? It means that every physical event must have a prior physical cause. Now, that would mean that nothing like God or souls can be involved. Why? Because these are immaterial things. So let's ask a question. What made the rock move? That made the staff. What made the staff move? My hand. What made me move? Now, if a physicalist wants to avoid God or the soul, they're going to have to say something like a neuron firing in my brain caused the hand to move, that caused the rock to move, that caused the staff to move, staff and the rock. And thus, because of this, we can say that, well, I'm the first cause of the actions, I have free will, and no soul is needed, right? But time out, flag on the field. Excuse my humor. What's wrong with this? Is it
You gotta explain the neuron.
the neuron? Why? Because it's still what? A physical event. Right. So again, according to the law of cause or closure, if every physical event must have a physical cause, then we now have to ask the question, what causes neuron firing to fire? Well, at this point, the non-believer can say two options. The first is, well, another neuron firing caused my first neuron to fire. But again, this is only pushing back the goalposts, because then you have to ask, well, what made this neuron fire that caused the first to fire? Well, they can say, well, another neuron did that. But again, you're going to keep going. And you notice that at some point, it's going to get so convoluted that the action will actually never be able to be accomplished, because you're going to have this infinite regress, and then it'll just kind of keep going and will crash the computer. So the first option won't do. So in other words, again, we're trying to explain what caused this chain of events. And again, we saw that if you're going to say the neuron fired, you're still going to have to explain that by something else. So again, the first option won't work. So second option. What you're going to have to say at some point is that whatever happened in this chain of events, at some point, something prior and external to my neurons firing actually is the thing that caused my neuron to fire, that caused a hand to move, that caused a rock to move. But note what happens. You're no longer the first cause, and thus free will cannot exist. So going back to the argument, I'm either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. If I am a purely physical object, then I do not possess free will. Well, if there's no soul, there's no free will. However, I do possess free will. Therefore, I am not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul. Now, suppose though an atheist says, hold on, I reject your third premise. I don't believe in free will. Here's a problem with that. There's two things to consider. The first thing is this. A lot of atheists like to call themselves, what I've heard the popular term is a free thinker, right? Which means that they are free to think for themselves. They don't need to be bound by religion or the shackles of religion. They are free to think, and they don't need to be brainwashed by any other religion or priest or pastor telling them what to do. In fact, they kind of get a little vulgar with this. And we can call this idea rational responsibility or intellectual integrity, which is the idea that I have come to hold to my beliefs on the basis of my own free will. I studied the evidence for myself, and I logically followed wherever the evidence led, and nothing forced me or caused me to come to this conclusion because, again, I'm a free thinker. In fact, when it comes to morality, they would even argue something similar, that you don't need God to tell you what's right or wrong. You don't need religion. In fact, they'll say something like, science flies you to the moon, religion flies you into buildings. I think it was Christopher Hitchens who said that. So again, we can call this now moral responsibility. So you have these two claims that a non-believer would also want to make. I have a rational responsibility, this intellectual integrity, and I have this moral responsibility that I don't need God for either. But here's a problem. Again, going back to our free will analogy, note that the only reason we can have moral responsibility is if and only if the person who caused the murder was the first mover in this causal chain of events. And thus we can say these are secondary causes. Again, he's the first cause. However, if we're going to go back to the only option that the non-believer physicalist has, then you're going to have to say something else caused the guy to fire the gun that caused the bullet to fire and kill the person. But note what happens now, whatever this is the first cause, and now you become merely a secondary cause in the chain of events. And again, there is no free will and hence no moral responsibility. The same would apply to rational responsibility as well. So in summation, we can say that if rational responsibility and moral responsibility exist, then free will must exist. And if free will must exist, then a soul must exist. However, if there is no soul, then there can be no free will. And if there's no free will, there can be no rational responsibility or intellectual integrity. So here's a problem. If the person is affirming that they freely came to be an atheist, and that people should be held morally responsible for what they do, well, then guess what? Free will must exist. And if free will must exist, then I'm not a purely physical object, therefore I am a soul. So reviewing really quick, the importance of the soul. Scripture says, love God with all your mind. Second, if there's no soul, I argue there's no resurrection, and thus Christianity would be false. The soul was defined as an immaterial substance that contains consciousness and animates the body. We focus on these 2 points: consciousness is not physical, and that I am an immaterial substance. 2 basic points, which I just said: consciousness not physical, more than a brain and body, I am a soul. Now, for the first point, we saw that there were 5 states of consciousness: thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and volition. And then we saw that based on Leibniz's law of identity, my mind and brain are not the same thing. Why? Because there are things true, they're not true of the other. And we saw that cause or dependence is not the same thing as identity. So, second point, we looked at 3 arguments: identity through change, the indivisibility of personhood, and free will. For this argument, we saw that in order for rational responsibility and moral responsibility to exist, well, that can only exist if free will exists. And if there is no free will, then you can have neither of these 2. But if you do have these 2, then free will must exist. And if free will exists, then the soul must exist. Like I said, you can go here, type that in. Would really appreciate a subscribe. Shameless plug. I think you'll enjoy a lot of some of the debates I've done. The most recent debate I did was, is God necessary for morality? And I think that was a really good one, probably one of my favorites. So that being said, questions, comments, contentions, clarifications? Yes. Mm-hmm.
I know some people believe that still have some kind of right that people or that in their lives conscious in some aspects. So, how would you if someone's trying to use these arguments to like an animal or not, because I believe most Christians do that in their provinces, that well. So I was just wondering about that.
Yeah, so a few things to say. So first, I would say, historically speaking, believers have always believed animals had souls. It wasn't until Darwin came around and said that they came about through naturalistic evolution that we say, well, then I guess they don't have souls because they don't need God to create it. But that's just, quite frankly, the church swallowing naturalism hook, line, and sinker. In fact, before I answer the question, let me do this quick thought experiment that I like to do everywhere I go. In other talks, I talk about naturalism, which is essentially what physicalism would stem from. What would you say if I told you that naturalism is not only permeating our culture, but has infiltrated our church and our way of thinking, and we haven't even realized it? Let me show you how. Quick experiment, audience participation. Point to what part of your body thinks. Point to what part of your body thinks. Okay, I see this. So brain, the brain thinks. Yeah. Do you need a brain to think? Yeah. Okay. Next question. Does God have a brain? Sorry. I didn't hear you. Is this a Mormon group? Yeah. So God does not have a brain, right? We're not Mormons. We believe he is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. God doesn't have a brain, but does God think? Absolutely. Psalm says that his thoughts towards me are more than the grains of sand. He's crazy about me. He's crazy about you too. But now we kind of have this conundrum. If it's true that you need a brain to think, and it's a brain that thinks, and yet here's the next question: are you in his image? Okay. So here's the problem. How is it that we live in a society, in a culture, in an academic setting, that you're told it's your brain that thinks, and why? Don't have time to get into it, but essentially, you have this pseudo neutrality, and the church really shot itself in the own foot, in her own foot, by allowing this to happen, where there became this, historically speaking, the separation of the secular and the sacred, where when it comes to sacred things, we'll teach that in Sunday school. We'll talk about the soul, we'll talk about God, we'll talk about spirits and angels. But if you want to quote secular education, you go to an academic university and they'll teach you the brain thinks. So we go to this culture, and we live in this culture that tells you your brain thinks. But then you show up Sunday morning to church and you raise your hands and worship a God who has no brain and thinks just fine, but we never let these two beliefs come together, because if we did, we'd be in trouble. Because God forbid if we took our theology seriously, right? I'm leaving after this if you don't like that. I don't know. So that being said, historically speaking, Christians have believed animals have souls for many reasons. One, if you go to, so I don't speak Hebrew, but you can go to blueletterbible.com and look at the translations of the Greek and Hebrew. If you go to Genesis, and when it says that God made the land animals, it says he made the nephesh creatures. Nephesh would be a Hebrew word for soul. So literally Genesis is saying God made the soul land creatures. Why animals have souls? Well, as I argued in my case, consciousness is immaterial. And yes, many animals are conscious. But if consciousness exists and it's immaterial, it would have to be possessed by some immaterial substance, namely a soul. So if an animal is conscious, then guess what? It has to have a soul in order for it to be conscious. A good rule of thumb is if something's conscious, all bets are off if it has a soul. Now, that's part of answering your question. A second point would be, so if someone wanted to use these arguments to say animals have souls, I'd say yes and amen. But then if they wanted to go further and argue, but they should have the same rights as us, I would say, well, time out. I believe equal things should be treated equally, but I believe that unequal things should be treated unequally, right? Without going too deep, from a theological perspective, animals are not made in God's image. We are. And then it becomes a question of, well, what gives us rights and value intrinsically in the first place? And I would say, well, theologically speaking, it's that we're made in God's image. That's one reason I would reject the annihilationist position, if y'all are familiar with that, because I think it would be immoral of God to destroy something that bears his image. On top of that, I would say that the animal souls and a human soul are far different for many reasons. Again, without going too deep metaphysically, trying to think where to take this. The reason you have a human body is because you have a human soul. And the reason a dog has a dog body is because it has a dog soul. Here's what I mean by that. Suppose I were to take this chair, and I didn't show you what it was, but I put a blanket over it. While you could not see the chair, you would see the form that the blanket takes. And hence the shape of the blanket lets you know what's underneath it. In the same way, when I look at your body, I'm seeing an external expression of the capacities of your soul. So the reason you have eyes is not just because your body felt like making it, it's because your soul has a capacity for sight. And I'm speaking figuratively here. Your soul said, I should develop some eyes in order to use this capacity. And I should develop the ears to use the capacity, and so forth and so forth. That's why when you look at dog brains and human brains, there are certain aspects and a greater level of complication to a human brain than a dog brain, because the human soul has more capacities than a dog soul. So, for example, I can have thoughts, and my dog Bella at home, she can have thoughts too. But the difference is I have this higher order level of thinking where not only can I have thoughts, but I can actually have thoughts about my thoughts. I can have beliefs, and then I can have beliefs about my beliefs, whereas my dog only shows evidence of having the level of thoughts and beliefs, but not. And thus, I would say because of that, it would show that our souls are different, and thus there's different value that should be placed on each. One last thing I'd say that I couldn't touch too much on is that there I know William and Craig and who is it, Trent, I forget his name, Trent Doherty, I want to say, wrote a book on animal suffering, and he argues that animals actually don't feel pain in the order that we do. It's a bit complicated, and it sounds counterintuitive, but when I'm in pain, not only do I know that I'm feeling pain, I know that I, as a conscious subject, and the one experiencing the pain, there's a certain level of dread that I feel, whereas the animal consciousness doesn't rise to that level. Now, don't get me wrong, while I'm sure they still feel some level of pain, there's some comfort in knowing that their level of pain awareness doesn't rise to the level that we have it. And I could say that that's, if anything, a mercy of God that he's put on them. Lots more can be said there, but yeah, animals have souls. They're different kind of souls. We're made in God's image, they're not, and our pain level of pain awareness is different as well. Yeah.
The argument that some people will be like, oh, all dogs are women or animals, we do have those restrictions where we treat them one.
So a few things again. One, stop talking to those Christians who say animals don't have souls, because they're wrong.
That's what I.
The second thing, and I'm trying to get some paper so I can, does anybody have a piece of paper? I thought I had it. Yeah. I have ADHD, so I forget things really fast if I don't write them down. Thank you for laughing at my mental disorder. There you go. Thank you. Yeah. I really do. I'll show you my medication later. So a few things. Aside from the erroneous assumption that a lot of Christians do have animals don't have souls, the other erroneous assumption is that a soul by nature is eternal or immortal. I don't believe that's the case. I believe the reason we are immortal is because we're made in God's image. Therefore, if the dog is not made in God's image, it has no default nature of immortality. So God sustains us in existence because we bear his image, but he has no obligation to sustain an animal in existence because it does not bear his image. So I don't know where I land on this. I would like to, so let me separate this into two questions. Will animals be in heaven? It appears so from scripture. It does appear that there will be animals in heaven. The next question is, will they be the same animals we had here on earth? That I don't know. But a few things to be said. Again, one, my second argument, that was my first argument, identity through change of part replacement. If animals are in heaven, then it makes sense, just like us. If I'm not my body, then you can replace whatever you want. As long as I'm my soul, then I can have a different type of body in the afterlife or in heaven, a glorified body, as the Bible says, which could actually have new capacities and a new type of properties to it, and yet still remain the same person because again, I'm not my body. I would say the same thing could apply to an animal, and that would make sense for the animal to be in heaven. But there's also the case that maybe God does not sustain their existence, but creates new ones when we get there. Yeah.
That's just sorry. One more.
No, please go ahead.
If the body is kind of like a reflection of the soul, probably the soul, like a human soul, out of the body. By that logic, if the body, like just going along that, would that mean the soul would have the body?
Good question. So no, because it's a one-way street in this aspect. It's I'll go as far as to say this. Your soul is actually what drives the formation of your body, not your DNA. Your DNA is just a blueprint. Think of a house. You have a blueprint and you have the wood and the bricks. They don't make things by themselves. You need a builder. The soul is what takes the DNA, the information, and actually forms the body itself. So once it's formed though, then yeah, I can change stuff just like I can change the things in my house, but that doesn't mean that the soul changes. In fact, if you were to take out my eyeballs, I'd go blind and wouldn't be able to see. But if the technology arose that you could put in artificial eyes, I would be able to see again. But it wasn't because my eyes saw, it's because my soul saw. So I don't see, so my eyes don't see, I see, but I just see through my eyes. If that were the case, yes, but let me ask you, what do you mean by, like, give me an example of new functions that you're thinking of. So that wouldn't be a new function. It would just be a finer tuned function. It would just be like putting on glasses on someone who doesn't see very well. Sure, and I would say so, and I think that in itself has something to say, though. I think that has to go into the fact that, well, if I can't conceive of it, how would it be possible in the first place? Now, I will say this that I found intriguing. It could also be the case that there are certain latent capacities within our soul that, I'm using loose language here, that would have to be unlocked, so to speak. And I think this is why we will have different powers, if you will, with our glorified body. When you read the Gospels, it clearly says that the doors were locked and Jesus shows up, but he has a physical body, right? How do we know that? He was touched, he ate fish, he walked with him. So if his body is an example of what our body will be like, then apparently there were some capacities that were unlocked in this glorified state. But the reason I asked you about examples of functionality, because I would say you cannot express any functions that are not already within your soul to begin with. Here's what I mean. If I were to take an acorn and plant it in the ground, it has the capacity because of its nature to grow a root system and become a tree. But if I planted you in the ground, no matter what I did to you, you would never become a tree. Why? Because it's not within your nature. So I can't unlock capacities that are not already there to begin with. Why? Because there's a certain essence and nature to everything. There's certain limits to what it can and cannot do, which is one of the reasons I would reject Darwinian evolution. Not necessarily sure. While I appreciate science, I'm more of a philosopher than a science. And I say metaphysically speaking, there are only certain capacities within things nature. And once it changes a nature, it's no longer the thing that it was in the first place. It's like saying the number 2 could cease to be even and still exist. What would that even mean? So every nature has certain limits and you can't go past those limits.
Kyle's point, extrasensory perception could be a valid function that the soul, in certain people, the soul has been enabled to unlock that capacity.
Yes, and of course, at this point, it becomes speculation. Like I've heard some people say, which I bought for a time, but I don't buy now. Could be wrong, but some people say when you get to heaven, you'll be able to like smell colors. Well, I don't think colors have the property of having a smell. So it's not as if something has to be unlocked. I just think it's a contradiction or it's a category fallacy. But yeah, sure, there may be a finer tuned capacities and something like being able to teleport. It seems like Jesus did, or walk through walls, or even without a glorified body. This seemed to happen in the book of Acts. I believe it was it Stephen? Philip. That's right, Philip, where basically, if you read it, God teleports him to some place to talk to this guy and then teleports him back. Yeah, he can do whatever he wants, but it was within the nature for it to be done in the first place. Sure. Right. So while embodied, we are going to be dependent on the body that we live in. It's kind of like while you're in a car, you're dependent on the car to get around town. If it breaks down and let's say you're locked in, you can't move. Or if your steering wheel only turns left, then all you will be able to do is turn left. But it wouldn't follow that you are the car. So while on this earth, what gives us the causal power to interact with the physical world around us is that we are within a physical body. This is a loose, rough and ready analogy, but it's kind of like playing a video game. If you want to have causal interaction within the game, you have to select a character, and it's through that character you can have functionality in the game. You can't enter the game, but you can enter, or even a better one. What was that movie with the blue alien thingies? Avatar, yes, something like that. Where in order to have causal power within the system, you need something that's within the system that you can interact with and use, so to speak. No, I'm saying if we didn't have a body, we wouldn't be able to interact with the world around us. And the way in which, I'm sorry? Right. So what you need is you need some type of connection, if you will. And again, I'm using loose vocabulary here. The soul communicates to the brain communicates to the body, would be the rough and ready way to look at it. Anything that happens physically, there's neurons firing. Every time I move, my brain sends a signal to my nervous system that makes my hand go up or things like that. Right. Sure. I go back to my guitar analogy. My guitar doesn't contain the music, nor does a guitar by itself play the music. But if I tune it a certain way and pluck certain strings and hold some down, I'll be able to convey something that I could not convey without the guitar itself. I can't play the note C, but if you give me a guitar and I knew how to play it, I could. It's all right. I would say because you're embodied, anything your soul does, there's going to be neural activity, even if it's thinking out loud to yourself. I would say so. Yeah, I would say so for sure. I wouldn't use that word, but yeah, that helps. Yeah. And here's the thing too. So in debates, like I said, this always comes up about this interaction with what's called the interaction problem. But I don't think it's a problem for us. I think it's a problem for the physicalists because so I've had atheists say we can detect brain patterns, but we never. How did I'm trying to think how they put it before. Basically, we can detect the mind, but we can't detect the soul. And my question is, how do you detect the mind? And they say brain patterns. I said, I didn't ask how you detect the brain. How do you detect the mind? Neurons firing. And then I write it down on a piece of paper. Detect the mind, detect the brain. And I say, how do you detect the mind? And they talk about the brain. And I circle it. I say, I'm not asking about this one. I'm asking about this one. You see the difference? To assume that the brain is nothing more than the mind, not that you're doing it, is to assume physicalism. But if physicalism isn't true, then it's a fair question. How do you detect the mind in the first place? One of the arguments I didn't go over for consciousness is that consciousness is what's called a first-person introspective awareness or a first-person private access. Here's what I mean. You can know that there are things you can know about me from a third-party perspective. You can know what I look like. You can know my hair color, all these type of secondary properties. But you can never know what I'm thinking. Now let's apply this to the brain. You can know more about my brain than I do, but you can never know more about my thought life than I do. A neurosurgeon can know more about the intricacies of my brain than me, but he can never know more about my thoughts than I do. So if consciousness were physical and quote in the brain, then looking at the brain would be looking at the mind. But I can't look at the mind and see what someone's thinking. I have to ask them what they're thinking. Why? Because consciousness is an internal introspective awareness. It is not a third party that's available to a third party observer.
You've got other questions, but let me jump in because I think something I'm gonna hopefully not send you in the wrong direction, but near-death experiences. Can you talk about NDEs as it relates to another piece of evidence for the mind and not connected to the brain?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
And that may give Justin another.
Do y'all know what NDEs are? Who does not know what an NDE is? Anybody not know? Okay. Yeah. So there's I think 3 to 5 categories of NDEs. Without going too deep, and I think they're remarkable. I do believe they happen. There was a study published by. There are actually quite a few studies published in scientific journals by medical doctors about NDEs. It's now like a huge field of. I've got like 3 or 4 books that I have. Basically, I'm trying to think how to get to the point as quick as possible. And at this time of night, my medicine is worn off. So bear with me here. When you have when your heart stops beating within like I don't want to say something wrong, but let's say within a minute. I'm just making it up because I can't remember. Within a minute, you have no brain activity. So when there's no heart and no brain activity, the person is dead. There have been I can give you a list of books later. One is like The Science of Near-Death Experiences. And this was published by, I think, Michigan State University, probably. Again, don't quote me. I'll have to look it up. But here's some interesting cases. Pam Anderson, I believe her name was. Unless I'm thinking of the actress, Pam Reynolds. Yeah, I was thinking of the actress, Pam Reynolds. Long story short, she had this brain tumor in a spot that was so complicated. I think only like 2 doctors in the world were even able to perform the surgery that were certified to do it. So she took a chance and went to one of the doctors and said, I want you to do this. And again, only him and one other person in the world were certified to do this. Said, fine, we'll do it, but it's very risky. Here's how the operation goes. Again, it's a very complicated surgery. First, because of where the tumor's at, you have to drain every ounce of blood, at least like from the neck up, every ounce of blood. So because you can't just perform the surgery where it's at, otherwise the person will bleed to death and you know where it's at. So basically, the way they do the surgery is they put the person under, and they put these like earbuds in that has a constant clicking, so they can monitor the brain activity, because if the person's conscious, they'll hear the clicking and they'll see brain activity. So they put the clicking in, they put the person under, and they pretty much, I don't know where they cut, but they cut somewhere and drain every ounce of blood out, turn the person upside down. And while they do this, or before they do this, they have to lower the body's temperature to like a certain degree where it's like almost frozen. And then they have like a 30-minute window to perform the operation, put the blood back in, and then slowly bring the body temperature back up. The person is dead. Like, I mean, there's like no other clear case to put it. When she came back, she started, again, I don't remember the exact time frame, but she started saying things like, hey, why were you doing this when you were doing the surgery? You look like a chicken. Well, because the doctor wanted to keep their hands clean, in order to point, they would use their elbows. Then he said, and you put, one of these things, you put it in like this particular yellow colored bag. And then you were saying this about me. In fact, you even said, oh my gosh, it's worse than I thought. What were you talking about? Now, let's just say she was conscious. She has ear things in her ear that are clicking. She wouldn't be able to hear what they're saying, and there was no brain activity. There's a lot more to be said here, but at one point the doctor was kind of taking her seriously and it's like, can you describe the operation for me? Now, he was expecting to hear something like what you would see on a movie. If you're going to do an operation on the skull, you get the buzzsaw and this and that. She goes, well, you had this kit, it looked like a toolbox, and then you put out what looked like an electric toothbrush. And he immediately he was like, whoa, because that was actually the drill he used. He didn't use a saw, he used a drill. It's a specific kind of tool. And then she starts describing the operation, and the doctor said her description was so accurate, he could have used that testimony to teach a class on how to do the operation. There's a lot more. I'll share one more story, and I'll try not to cry because it tears me up every time. This little girl drowned at a certain age, and then of course, I think she was like dead for 30 minutes, and they brought her back. And over the next few months, she started telling her parents about seeing Jesus and going to heaven and stuff like that. And the parents just kind of thought, asked the doctors, hey, she's saying this, what should we do? They said, she's a kid, just entertain it, right? Don't think nothing of it. Just, it might help her, process the trauma. I think it was like during Thanksgiving, one Thanksgiving, where the whole family was at the table. Little girl, 5 or 6 years old. She comes up to her mom and says, I didn't know I had a sister. I'm going to try not to tear up. The mom says, what are you talking about? You're talking about your cousin Sophia. I said, no, my sister. I met her in heaven. Mom got really pale and scared. And the dad's like, what are you talking about? And she says, well, I met my sister in heaven, and you never told me I had one. And the mom said, what was your sister's name? And she said, well, she told me she didn't have a name because you never gave her one. You sucked her out of your tummy. She said this in front of everybody. Embarrassing for the family. The couple ended up getting divorced. Not all NDEs are happy-go-lucky, but here you have a case of a child not knowing what a D&E suction abortion is, not knowing anything about this, and it was a secret. The mother had an affair, and yet here she is talking about her sister in heaven that she never knew existed. And I mean, of course, the mother broke down crying, and the little girl says, "It's okay, God adopted her." I'm not crying, you're crying. So you have a lot of these kind of cases that are just so interesting, where the only explanation would be, yeah, there was an out-of-body experience, and of course, people didn't have it. Long story short, they didn't have brains. And
the reason I bring it up, thank you. To me, it's one of great proofs.
Sure.
Again, this and the phenomena is you can't explain. Another one, without going way down the rabbit trail, is someone who lost brain activity. They were effectively flatlined in a hospital, and they got them back. And when they got them back, the person described family members who were out in the lobby who she had no idea that they had come to the hospital. She described them in full hospital. She described the car accident that happened in the city a few blocks away from the hospital. And she could read the serial number on top of the equipment that was in her room.